And what I'm about to share with you may not be the most pleasing thing to your ears, but it's very important for you to understand so that you will see the price which Jesus paid on the cross. Sometimes we're a little deluded because we see beautiful crosses and women wear beautiful jewelry with even diamonds on the crosses, and we think of the cross as a beautiful thing. But in fact, what Jesus suffered on the cross was a hideous, hideous thing. And today I'm going to read to you directly from Sparkling Gems, beginning in Matthew 27 and verse 35. The Bible says, "And they crucified him." The word crucified is the Greek word stereo from the word staros, which describes an upright, pointed stake that was used for the punishment of criminals. Now this might be new for you. You might find this interesting. The word was used to describe those who were hung up, impaled, or beheaded, and then publicly displayed. It was always used in connection with public execution. The point of hanging a criminal publicly was to bring further humiliation and additional punishment to the one that was accused. Crucifixion was indisputably the cruelest and most barbaric form of punishment in the ancient world. Josephus, the Jewish historian, described crucifixion as the most wretched of all deaths. And in fact, it was viewed with such horror that in one of Seneca's letters, Seneca wrote that suicide was preferable to crucifixion. And different parts of the world had different kinds of crucifixions. For example, in the East, a victim was beheaded and then hung in public display. Among the Jews, the victim was first stoned to death and then hung on a tree. Even the book of Deuteronomy talks about crucifixion. Deuteronomy 21, 22, and 23 commanded, "And if a man have committed a sin worthy of death and be put to death, thou shalt hang him on a tree." This was the act of crucifixion among the Jews, and it ends by saying, "For he that hanged is accursed by God." It was the worst form of death. It was a public statement that this was a cursed individual. But at the time that Jesus was crucified, the grueling act of crucifixion was entirely in the hands of the Roman authorities. This punishment was reserved for the most serious offenders, usually for those who had committed some kind of treason or who had participated in or sponsored state terrorism. And because Israel hated the occupying Roman troops, insurrections frequently occurred in the land of Israel. And to stop people from participating in these riots and insurrections, the Romans regularly practiced the act of crucifixion. And by publicly crucifying those who attempted to overthrow the government, the Romans sent a strong signal of fear to anyone who might be tempted to participate in a revolt or an insurrection. Once an offender, the person to be crucified, had reached the place where the crucifixion was to occur, he was laid on the crossbeam that he carried with his arms outstretched. Then a soldier would drive a 5-inch nail through each of his wrists into the crossbeam. After being nailed to the crossbeam, the victim was hoisted up by a rope, and the crossbeam was dropped into a notch on top of the upright post. When the crossbeam dropped into the groove, the victim suffered excruciating pain as his hands and wrists were wrenched by the sudden jerking motions. Then the weight of the victim's body caused his arms to be pulled out of their sockets. Josephus writes that the Roman soldiers, out of rage and hatred, amused themselves by nailing their prisoners in different postures. Crucifixion was truly a hideous ordeal. When the victim was nailed to his cross, the nails were not driven through the palms of his hands, but through his wrists. And once the wrists were secure in place, the feet came next. First, the victim's legs would be positioned so the feet were pointed downward with the soles pressed against the post on which the victim was suspended. A long nail would then be driven between the bones of the feet, lodged firmly between those bones to prevent it from tearing through the feet as the victim arched upward, gasping for breath. And in order for the victim to breathe, he had to push himself up by his feet, which were nailed to the vertical beam. But because the pressure on his feet became unbearable, it wasn't possible for him to remain long in this position, so eventually he would collapse back into the hanging position. And as the victim pushed up and collapsed back down again and again over a long period of time, his shoulders eventually dislocated and popped out of joint. Soon the out-of-joint shoulders were followed by the elbows and the wrists. And these various dislocations caused the arm to be extended up to 9 inches longer than usual, resulting in terrible cramps in the victim's arm muscles and making it impossible for him push upward any longer to breathe. And when he was finally too exhausted and could no longer push himself upward on the nail lodged in his feet, the process of asphyxiation began. Jesus experienced all of this torture. When he dropped down with the full weight of his body on the nails that were driven through his wrists, it sent excruciating pain up his arms, registering horrific pain in the brain. Added to this torture was the agony caused by the constant grating of Jesus' back, which had just been scourged, as he pressed upward and downward, his back constantly rubbing against the post on which he hung. And due to the extreme loss of blood and hyperventilation, the victim would then begin to experience severe dehydration. We can see this very process in Jesus' own crucifixion when he cried out, "I thirst." After several hours of this torment, the victim's heart would begin to fail. Next, his lungs would collapse. Excess fluids would begin filling the lining of his heart and his lungs, adding to the slow process of asphyxiation. And when the Roman soldier came to determine whether or not Jesus was alive or dead, he thrust his spear into Jesus' side. One expert has pointed out that if Jesus had been alive when the soldier did this, the soldier would have heard a loud sucking sound caused by air being inhaled past the freshly wound which was made in his chest. But the Bible tells us that water and blood mixed together came pouring forth from the wound that the spear had made, and this was evidence that Jesus' heart and lungs had shut down and were filled with fluid. He literally smothered to death in his own fluids. This was enough to let the soldier know that Jesus was already dead. And it was customary for Roman soldiers to break the lower legs of a person being crucified, making it impossible for the victim to push himself upward to breathe, and thus causing him to asphyxiate at a much quicker rate. But because of the blood and water which gushed from Jesus' side, he was already considered dead. So there was no reason for the soldiers to hasten his death, and therefore his legs were never broken. This, my friend, is a Roman crucifixion. It's a very different picture from crosses studded with diamonds. What Jesus underwent for us was unthinkable. In fact, when the Apostle Paul wrote about it, in Philippians chapter 2, he wrote that he humbled himself even unto death, even the death of the cross. The word even is the Greek word daje. It's even hard to translate it. It means, can you imagine? He stooped so low that he even, hard to believe it, hard to even say it, hard to comprehend it, even the death of a cross. There was no death worse than this. But yet this is where Jesus, as the Lamb of God, died for me and died for you. As he entered into the holy place, not with the blood of bulls and goats or lambs, but with his own precious blood, he purchased our redemption. And that's why today, both you and I are the sons and daughters of God. And I think it would be wise for you today just to take a few minutes to stop before you do anything else. Before you go to work, before you drink your next cup of coffee, before you get up and clean the house, whatever you're doing, just stop. Take a few moments to say, Jesus, thank you for dying on the cross for me.